The storm that night was the worst the county had seen in 40 years. By 9 o'clock in the evening the snow was coming down so hard that the world had disappeared into a howling wall of white, and the temperature had fallen to a place where exposed skin begins to die in minutes. The radio warned everyone to stay indoors. The highways were closed. The town had gone dark and silent, every family shuddered inside against a cold that could kill, and out in that lethal white nothing, almost nothing living moved. Almost nothing. Because out on the frozen edge of town, a sheriff's patrol vehicle crept along a buried road, and inside it were the only two souls foolish enough or brave enough to be out in it. A young deputy named Rachel Owens, and beside her, in the back, her partner. A German shepherd named Bear. They were doing welfare checks. On a night like that one, the most dangerous thing in the county is not crime. It is the cold itself, and the people it can catch out in the open, the stranded motorist, the confused elderly soul, the drunk who wandered the wrong way home. So Deputy Owens and her dog crawl through the blizzard, checking the places where the cold takes people, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of keeping the vulnerable alive. And then, on a stretch of empty road where there was nothing but snow and darkness and the shriek of the wind, Bear went rigid in the back seat and began to bark. It was not his ordinary bark. Rachel had worked beside the dog for 4 years and she had never heard the sound he was making now, this frantic, desperate, insistent alarm, his whole body slamming against the door, his eyes fixed on something out in the white that no human being could possibly see. She stopped the vehicle. And the moment she cracked the door, before she could even reach for his lead, Bear was gone, exploding out into the storm and vanishing into the snow at a dead run, toward something out there in the killing dark that his nose had found and his heart could not ignore. What that dog dragged back out of the snow that night is a thing the people of that town will be telling their grandchildren about 100 years from now. And the answer to the question it left behind, the question of how it came to be there at all, is a truth so shattering that when they finally uncovered it, not one soul who heard it was ready. So stay with me, all the way to the end. Because this is a story about the coldest night of a generation, and about the two things on this earth that even a cold like that one cannot kill. The nose of a faithful dog. And the love of a mother. Before I tell you what Bear found in the snow, you should know something about the dog, and about the young woman who was his partner. Rachel Owens had wanted to be in law enforcement since she was a little girl, and she had wanted, specifically, to work with a dog. She was not a big woman, and she was not a loud one, and there were plenty of people early in her career who had looked at her and quietly doubted she had what it took. She proved them wrong the way the best people do, not with noise, but with a steadiness and a heart that never quit. And when she finally earned her place in the county's small K-9 unit, they partnered her with a young German shepherd that some of the other handlers had found a little too gentle for the work. His name was Bear, and he was gentle. That was the truth of him. He could do the job, all of it, the tracking and the searching and the hard parts too. But there was a softness in that big dog, a sweetness, a way he had of being drawn to the frightened and the fragile, that set him apart. Rachel used to say that Bear was less interested in catching the bad than he was in protecting the good. On more than one search, he had found the lost person they were looking for and then simply refused to leave them, lying down beside a scared runaway teenager or a wandering old man and pressing close, guarding them until help arrived. The other handlers teased her about it. A guard dog with the heart of a nursemaid. But Rachel would just smile, because she understood something about her partner that the others did not. She understood that Bear's gentleness was not a weakness. It was a gift. And she had a feeling, though she could never have explained why, that one day that specific gift, that particular tenderness toward the smallest and most helpless, was going to matter more than anyone could imagine. She had no idea how right she was. Or how soon. Or that it would be on the coldest night of her life. The cold that night was not like ordinary cold. It was a living thing, a predator, and everyone in that county knew it. When the Weather Service uses certain words, the old-timers pay attention, because they remember what those words mean. And that night the words were the worst ones. Life-threatening. Do not go outside. The kind of cold where the air itself hurts to breathe, where a stranded person has not hours but minutes, where the storm erases the whole world and leaves only white and wind and a silence that swallows every cry for help. Rachel and Bear were out in it because that was the job, and because Rachel Owens was not the kind of person who could sit warm inside knowing that somewhere out in that white, someone vulnerable might be dying. So they crawled the back roads, the vehicle's heater roaring, the wipers losing their war against the snow, checking the culverts and the bus shelters and the frozen edges of town where the cold does its hunting. And it was on one of those empty, forsaken stretches, a place with no houses and no reason for anyone to be, that Bear caught the scent. To this day, no one can fully explain it. The snow was coming sideways. The wind was a scream. Every scent in the world should have been torn away and buried under a foot of fresh powder. But a dog's nose is a miracle we barely understand, a sense so far beyond our own that it might as well be magic, and somehow, through all of that howling chaos, Bear caught the one thread of scent in all the world that mattered most. Something small. Something warm, or trying to be. Something alive, out there in the killing white, where nothing alive should be. He did not hesitate. The instant Rachel opened the door he was gone, swallowed by the storm before she could even shout his name. And Rachel Owens plunged out after him into a cold that hit her like a wall, following the fading sound of his barking, wading through drifts to her thighs, her flashlight beam swallowed after 3 feet by the snow, her own heart hammering with a terror she could not name. She found Bear 20 yards off the road, in the lee of a low stone wall where the wind had scoured a hollow in the drifts. He was digging. Frantically, desperately, throwing snow behind him with both front paws, whining that high, terrible whine. And Rachel dropped to her knees beside him and shone her light down into the hollow he had opened, and for one endless moment her mind simply refused to understand what her eyes were seeing. There, in the snow, wrapped in a woman's coat, was a newborn baby. I need you to understand how impossible that was. How completely, utterly impossible. A newborn child. Hours old, by the look of it, still impossibly small, out in a cold that could kill a grown man in minutes. By every law of nature, by everything that should be true about the world, that baby should not have been alive. And yet, when Rachel Owens tore off her own gloves and reached down with shaking hands, she felt it. The faintest warmth. The smallest, most fragile flutter of life. The baby was alive. Barely, impossibly, against every odd there is, that child was still alive. And the reason, Rachel would understand later, was the coat. Whoever had left that baby had not simply left it. The child had been wrapped, and wrapped, and wrapped again, in layer after layer, in every scrap of warmth that could be found, and the outermost layer, the thing that had held all that precious heat against the tiny body, was a woman's winter coat. A good, thick, heavy coat. Wrapped with such care, such desperate, loving thoroughness, that even in that murderous cold it had held just enough life in that small body for a dog's nose to find it before the end. There was no time to think about any of that. Rachel Owens scooped the bundle against her own chest, inside her own jacket, sharing her own body heat the way you do, and she fought her way back through the storm to the vehicle with Bear pressing anxiously against her legs the whole way, and she got that baby into the roaring heat of the cab and she drove for the hospital through a blizzard. That should have made driving impossible, one hand on the wheel and one hand on the tiny chest, feeling for the heartbeat, talking the whole way, to the baby, to herself, to God. Stay with me, she said, the same words her whole profession says in the worst moments. Stay with me, little one. Stay with me. And in the back seat, Bear whined, and pressed his big head forward between the seats to lay his nose gently against the bundle, as if he too were saying it. Stay. Stay. We found you. Stay. The baby lived. Against everything, against a cold that should have taken that fragile life a dozen times over, the newborn that a gentle police dog dragged out of the snow survived. The doctors and nurses who worked over that tiny body through the night used the word miracle, and they are not people who use that word lightly. A little girl. Perfect, and whole, and alive, warmingly back into the world under the lights of the intensive care nursery, her tiny fingers curling around the finger of a weeping nurse. By morning, the whole town knew. In a place that size, a story like that travels fast, and this was not just any story. This was the miracle baby. The child that Deputy Owens and her dog had pulled from the jaws of the deadliest storm in 40 years. People wept when they heard it. They brought blankets and tiny clothes to the hospital. They called the newspaper. For a few hours, that frozen, frightened town was warmed by the sheer wonder of it, by the beautiful, impossible fact that a life had been saved that had no business surviving. But underneath the wonder, another feeling was already rising. And it was not a gentle one. Because a baby does not appear in a snowbank on its own. Someone had put that child there. Someone had walked out into a storm that could kill and left a newborn infant in the snow to freeze. And as the shock wore off, the town's wonder began to curdle into something harder. Into anger. Into judgment. What kind of person, people began to say to one another, in the diners and the church queues and the checkout lines. What kind of monster leaves a baby in the snow? What kind of mother could do such a thing? The story took on a villain. An unseen, heartless woman who had abandoned her own child to die in the cold. And the whole town, in its grief and its love for that miracle baby, turned its anger toward her, this mother no one had ever seen, and condemned her without a trial, without a name, without a single fact. Because they were certain, all of them, that they already knew the shape of the story. A baby saved. A monster who left it. They were wrong. Every last one of them was wrong. And the one soul in that whole county who could not quite bring herself to believe the easy, angry story was the young deputy who had held that baby against her heart through the storm. Rachel Owens could not let it go. There was something about that coat. She kept coming back to it, in the days that followed, turning it over in her mind. She had seen it up close. She had felt the desperate, meticulous care of the wrapping, layer upon layer, every scrap of warmth given over to that child. That was not the work of a monster. A monster does not wrap a baby in her own coat. A monster does not give a freezing child the very warmth off her own back. Rachel had held a lot of terrible things in her career, seen the real face of cruelty more than once, and this did not match. This did not match at all. And there was something else. Something that had been nagging at her since the moment she found the child. The baby had been wrapped in a woman's coat. Which meant that somewhere out in that killing storm, on the coldest night in 40 years, there was a woman without one. The thought would not leave her. She lay awake with it. And the more she turned it over, the more a terrible possibility took shape in her mind, a possibility so different from the town's angry story that it made her breath catch. What if the mother had not walked away? What if she had never left at all? Rachel went to her sergeant, and she made her case, and though he thought it was likely too late for whatever she was imagining, he saw the certainty in her eyes and he did not stop her. And so, 3 days after the storm, when the snow had finally stopped and the world lay buried in white and silent, Deputy Rachel Owens went back out to that low stone wall on the edge of town, with the only partner she trusted to find what she was afraid was out there. She brought Bear. And she gave him the scent from the coat. And she said, very quietly, "Find her, boy. Find the mother." And the gentle dog put his nose down into the snow, and began, once again, to trace a mother's desperate path. What Bear found, tracking back through the frozen aftermath of that storm, broke the heart of everyone who followed him. The dog worked carefully, following a scent trail 3 days old and buried under fresh snow, a trail that only a nose like his could ever have found. And as he worked, as he led Rachel and the other searchers step by step back along the path the mother had taken, a dreadful understanding began to settle over all of them. Because the trail was long. It went on, far longer than anyone had imagined. It wound back from that sheltered hollow by the wall, out across open fields, along a frozen creek, back toward the distant, dark line of the woods. And they understood, as they followed it, that the mother had not simply appeared at that wall and left the baby there. She had come from somewhere far away. She had traveled that entire brutal distance, through that entire brutal storm, carrying her newborn child. She had walked, and stumbled, and crawled, mile after freezing mile, toward the faraway lights of the town, toward help, toward safety, toward any chance of life for the baby in her arms. And she had made it, against everything, all the way to that sheltered hollow by the wall, close enough to the road that someone might find her child. And that, they realized, following the dog's nose with growing dread, was as far as she had been able to go. Bear stopped at the edge of the woods, where a fallen tree made a hollow against the cold. And he lay down. He did not dig this time, and he did not bark. He simply lay down, and pressed himself against a shape half buried in the snow, and let out a long, low sound of grief, the same tender thing he did when he found the frightened and the fragile and would not leave them. And Rachel Owens came up behind him, and looked down, and there she was. The mother. She lay curled in the snow where she had finally fallen, 3 days before, having given the last of her strength and the last of her warmth and the very coat off her own body to carry her child to safety. She had made it as far as a human being could possibly make it, and then a little farther than that, and then she had lain down in the cold, having done the only thing that mattered, having gotten her baby close enough to be found. She was not a monster. She had never been a monster. She was a mother who had walked into a storm that kills grown men, and had given absolutely everything she had, everything, down to the coat off her back and the warmth of her own body, to save the life of her child. And no one in that whole town that had cursed her name, had been ready for that. But this story does not end in the snow. Because Rachel Owens dropped to her knees beside that frozen shape, and with trembling hands she reached for a pulse she was certain she would not find. And she found one. It was fate. It was almost nothing. But it was there. Somehow, curled in that hollow, sheltered just enough by the fallen tree and by the deep insulating snow itself, some last stubborn ember of life still burned in the young mother. She was alive. Barely, impossibly, 3 days later, exactly as her baby had been. She was alive. And because a gentle dog had traced her path, because a young deputy had refused to believe the easy, angry story, help was there in minutes instead of never. They wrapped her, and warmed her, and rushed her through the white silence to the same hospital where her daughter lay, and a second miracle unfolded that week in that little town, the miracle of a mother pulled back from the very edge of death by the same faithful nose that had saved her child. She lived. It was a long road, and a hard one, and there were days her fragile life hung by a thread. But she lived. And when at last she was strong enough to speak, the whole terrible, beautiful truth came out. And the town that had condemned her learned, at last, the story of the young woman they had called a monster. Her name was Hannah. She was 19 years old. I will not tell you every detail of how she came to be alone, heavily pregnant, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to, on the night of the worst storm in 40 years. Some of it is hers to keep. But I will tell you the shape of it, because the town needed to hear it, and so do you. She was a girl who had fallen through every crack there is. A girl with no family that would help her, fleeing a situation that had become unsafe, with nothing to her name but the clothes on her back and the child she carried and a fierce, unshakable determination to protect it. She had been trying to reach the town, on foot, when the storm caught her. And out there in the freezing dark, alone, terrified, with no help within miles, Hannah had gone into labor and given birth to her daughter in the snow. She knew she was dying. She understood, with the terrible clarity that comes at the end, that she could not save herself. But she thought, perhaps, that she could still save her baby. And so, freezing, exhausted, having just given birth alone in a blizzard, Hannah did the most extraordinary thing. She took off her own coat. She wrapped her newborn daughter in it, and in her sweater, and in every scrap of warmth she had, layer upon layer, and then, with nothing left to shield her own body from the killing cold, she picked up her child and she began to walk toward the distant lights of the town. She walked for miles. No one who saw the distance could quite believe it was possible. She walked until her body simply would not carry her any farther, and when she could go no more, she used the very last of her strength to tuck her daughter into a sheltered hollow by a stone wall, close to the road, where someone might find her. And then she lay down a little way off, in the shelter of a fallen tree, and she waited for the end, having given her child every single thing she had to give, including her own life, or so she believed. Tucked inside the coat, against the baby's tiny body, they found a note. It was written in a shaking hand on a scrap of paper, and it was smudged where the ink had run, and it was the last thing Hannah had done before she could do no more. It was not a note of abandonment. It was the opposite. It was a mother's love, poured out in a few desperate words for a daughter she believed she would never see grow up. To whoever finds my baby, it read. Her name is Grace. Please love her. Please tell her that her mother loved her more than her own life. I'm sorry I couldn't give her more. I'm sorry. Please, please love her. That was the note. That was the monster the town had cursed. A dying girl in the snow, giving away the coat off her back and the last breath in her body, begging the world to love the child she could not save. When that note was read aloud, the whole town wept. And its anger, all of it, turned to ash and blew away, replaced by a shame so deep and a tenderness so overwhelming that the people of that place would never be quite the same again. They had judged her. And now they knew the truth. And a whole town set about, all at once, trying to make it right. The community that had called Hannah a monster now could not do enough for her. The blankets and the tiny clothes that had come for the baby were joined by a flood of everything a young mother and her daughter could need. People who had cursed her name stood in line to volunteer, to donate, to help. The shame of how wrong they had been became, in the best of them, a fierce determination to be better, to catch this girl who had fallen through every crack, and to hold her up. And they did. Hannah, who had faced that storm with no one in all the world, came out of that hospital into the arms of an entire town. She was given a safe place to live. She was given help, real help, the kind she had needed for so long and never found. The systems that had failed her were, this time, made to work, because a whole community stood behind her and would not let her fall again. She was given, at 19 years old, after a life that had given her so little, something she had never truly had before. A place to belong. People who would not leave. And most of all, she was given back her daughter. The reunion of Hannah and little Grace is a thing that the nurses who witnessed it still cannot describe without their eyes filling. A young mother who had walked into a blizzard and given her own life, as she thought, to save her child, holding that child again, warm and whole and safe, in a world that had turned out, after all, to be kinder than she had dared to believe. She held her baby, and she wept, and she whispered the words from the note over and over, only now she got to say them out loud, to a daughter who would live to hear them. Your mother loves you more than her own life. And this time, she got to add 3 more. And we made it. And Bear. Let us not forget the gentle dog whose nose had made all of it possible. Because Bear had not saved one life that terrible week. He had saved 2. He had dragged little Grace from the snow before the cold could take her, and then he had traced her mother's desperate path and found Hannah in time to pull her back from the very edge. 2 lives. A mother and a daughter, both given back to each other, both given back to the world, by the faithful heart and the miraculous nose of a police dog that some had once called too gentle for the work. His gentleness, it turned out, was the whole point. Rachel Owens had always known it. That softness in him, that pull toward the fragile and the freezing in the helpless, the very quality the other handlers had teased her about, was the thing that had made him break from the road that night and plunge into a killing storm for the sake of the smallest, most helpless life there is. A harder dog might have stayed in the warm vehicle. Bear could not. It was not in him. And because it was not in him, a mother and a daughter were alive. Hannah and Grace did not drift out of Bear's life after that, or out of Rachel's. How could they? The bonds forged in a thing like that do not break. Rachel Owens and her family became, in the years that followed, a kind of family to the young mother and her little girl, the anchor that Hannah had never had, the people who stayed. And Grace grew up knowing the whole story. She grew up knowing that her mother had walked into a storm and given everything to save her. And she grew up knowing the gentle old dog who had pulled her from the snow, because Bear was there, at every birthday and every holiday, for all the years of his long life. There is one image I will leave you with. It is from a few years later, a warm spring afternoon, in the yard of the little home where Hannah was raising her daughter. Grace was learning to walk. And the first steps that little girl ever took on her own, the very first, unsteady, wonderful steps, she took across the grass toward a graying old German shepherd who lay in the sun waiting for her, his tail sweeping the grass, his gentle eyes fixed on her the way they had been fixed on her in the snow on the night he saved her life. She toddled into his warm fur and threw her small arms around his neck, the way she would 1,000 more times in the years to come, and Bear laid his head against the child he had carried out of the storm, and closed his eyes, and was at peace. He had found her in the cold. And he would watch over her, that gentle dog, for the rest of his days. So that is the story of the miracle baby, and the mother the whole town got wrong, and the gentle dog who saved them both. Of everything in it, here is the part one cannot let go of. It is not the rescue in the snow, extraordinary as it was. It is that moment at the edge of the woods, when a young deputy who refused to believe the easy story followed her dog to the truth, and a whole town's anger turned, in an instant, to grief and to shame. Because we are all so quick, aren't we, to know the shape of a story before we know a single fact of it. We are all so quick to find the villain, to cast the stone, to look at a stranger's worst moment and decide we understand the whole of who they are. That town looked at a baby in the snow and was certain, all of them, that they knew what kind of mother would do such a thing. And not one of them was ready for the truth. That the mother they had cursed had given the coat off her own back in the last of her own life, and had walked miles through a storm that kills grown men, all so that her child might live. That what looked, from the outside, like the coldest kind of abandonment, was in fact the warmest and most total kind of love this world has ever known. There is a lesson in that, and it is worth carrying with you out of this story and into your own life. The next time you find yourself certain you know the whole of someone, certain you have understood their worst moment, certain you know just what kind of person they must be, remember Hannah. Remember the note in the coat. Remember that you are almost never seeing the whole story, and that behind the thing that looks like the worst of someone, there is so often a love, or a pain, or a sacrifice, that would break your heart if you only knew it. Dare to judge. Be quicker to wonder. Be like the deputy who could not quite believe the angry story, and went looking for the true one. And be like the gentle dog, who never judged anyone at all, who only ever ran toward the ones who needed him. If this story touched your heart, do me a kindness and leave a comment below. Tell me about a time you learned that the true story was nothing like the one you first believed. I read every single one, and those stories are the reason I do this. And if you believe, the way I do, that a love like Hannah's, and a heart like Bear's, deserve to be remembered, then give this video a like so more people get to hear it, and share it with someone who needs the reminder today to be a littler to judge and a little quicker to care. If you are new here, and you love true stories about loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond between people and the dogs who saved them, then subscribe and stay with us. Every week, I bring you another story, told all the way through, from beginning to end. Next time, I want to tell you about a police dog who suddenly refused to let a family board their flight, planting himself in front of the gate and would not move, and about the thing he alone had sensed, that no one understood until it was almost too late. Until then, Beto Judge, and quick to love.